one of the most interesting cases recorded was the Soviet pilot Apraksin, who observed gigantic cigar-shaped craft in 1949. This was his second encounter. It was like he was cursed, he said, sometimes with it, but he did observe it. And later, in the Soviet Union, you got to see more objects like that. Giant cigar-shaped objects with lights. And some of the information I was able to collect, so you can see, look, this is from 1950s. This was a very interesting case. A gigantic cylindrical object was sighted over the taiga, dense forest regions of Siberia, over the territory where they had concentration camps, secret facilities, and where people who were exiled after the camps lived. One of them was one of the best-known Soviet scientists, Veniamin Dodin. And he was the one that observed this object splitting into, it's like a big mothership splitting into smaller objects that were flying away consistently. And the biophysical effects on those below were horrendous. His psyche was, he described the pain he went through, and everything seemed green from pain and so forth. The local KGB ran away, and they told him to take measurements any way possible. And he did. They came back later, they took everything away from him. The object never took off. It stood over the taiga for some time until something blinked. Now, this was, it says this was in June of 1953. Stalin was gone. USSR was in disarray. Nobody knew who was going to really take the power. It was the secret police in charge. Beria at one week, and then he was overthrown. Somebody else came in. So they sent military jets against this object. The jets were destroyed, and whole areas of taiga were burned down because the UFO responded. And I think this is the time, based on my knowledge, that they got in touch with the Americans and have been in touch ever since, and possibly United Kingdom as well, to exchange top secret information about UFOs. It's very interesting that ever since they've been, from what we understand, in touch. There is no way we can prove it, but based on Russian information, that's what we think. Soviet Union, the Soviet government, yeah, that's what we understand. Now, this object was recovered. It's a small shuttle-like object that appeared out of nowhere in a Soviet military facility in a secretive area of the Kola Peninsula. In 1987, it stayed there for a while. They studied it. It was made, I remember, like said, for small, let's say, dwarf-like beings. This is the description they used. They couldn't make it work. They got inside. When I say they, it's special investigators from the Soviet Setka UFO research program. They broke off a piece. I remember they said it, which was, stupid. But after a while, this object simply disappeared from the hangar it was stored in. And I have a good description of it in my videos. Very interesting case. Now, there were reports that everything exploded and dissipated. Other reports say the object just disappeared. And the other one that you can see is one of the triangles that are observed over Russia or the former Soviet Union quite often, by military as well. This is one very interesting case I've never heard of in the United States or elsewhere. Solid rays. He ran into a solid ray, R-A-Y, shot down, coming from the UFO that Colonel Vyatkin encountered flying over southern USSR. It happened in 1967. Very interesting year for UFO research in the Soviet Union, and I'll get into it. 1967. I asked in Brazil, in China, no one had similar cases. Mongolia. Few people talk about Mongolia, if at all, but UFOs have been seen there for, I want to say ages, but people had observed them back, I know, at least in 1926 and other periods. The Soviets, of course, they had their own military people in Mongolia, and one of them had very interesting observations. of UFOs hovering over the area, and there was a lake too, not far away. A very detailed description. And this is one of the people who actually observed UFOs over Poland in 1944. Later in his life, he moved to Israel, and he was the honorary pilot in the Israeli Air Force. He sent me information and details about it, and he was very persistent, by the way, because he was a top gun in the Soviet Air Force, and he asked others about observations of unusual objects in the sky. And so other military pilots revealed their information to him, and he shared it with me years later. And this is during the Russian-Chechen wars. There were two wars in the recent times, and more before, but UFOs had always been observed over that territory. And very detailed military sightings were taken by the people who were fighting against the Russians and the Russian army as well. This is in more recent times. You can see some of the descriptions, alleged photograph, and what people observed seeing, like in 1991, 1995, and other periods. I don't have a lot of visual, as you can understand. It's very hard to get to, but whatever my friends supply, I show you. Now, in 1991, something interesting happened in the Soviet Union. A file of documents was released, KGB information. We can safely, consider KGB to be part of the Soviet military, because they always had their own people inside the Soviet military spying on everything. And 124 cases, 124 pages of incredible cases were released of gigantic objects flying over the Soviet Union, of interactions with fiery spheres, of strange impact on people below, and so forth. And what's interesting is that, of course, we believe that there are more cases that were never released to the general public. But this was outside of the program per se, the Setka program that the Soviet military and Soviet scientists ran together from 1978. The head of the Soviet secret police, Andropov, was very much interested in UFOs, and he had a file on his desk with most interesting cases. Some of them are here, and it says white rectangle in the sky together with the red triangles inside and projector at the top, and a few other cases. So at the very top of the Soviet government, they had general of interest, not only, but also particular to themselves, like Andropov. This is from the one of the most secretive areas, the Baikonur Cosmodrome, where they test spacecraft and advanced weaponry. UFOs were always present there. And the year 1978 is significant because at that time, over the Soviet Union, there were a few cases of UFOs which prompted the creation of this secret program. And it was secret. It ran actively from 1978 till 1991, and then 5 years later, semi-secretly, and now nobody knows what's going on. Because, for example, lights of the indefinite colors, and then it says, on the left it points to the body, and then it points to the size, how it differs from the size of the moon. And down below it says UFO, which flew over Baikonur on December 26, 1978, eyewitness testimony, or eyewitness drawing, let's put it that way. And that's, in the United States, there is a lot of talk of the Russian Area 51. If ever there is anything like that, it should be in Kapustin Yar. I have my doubts because my colleagues actually visited that area. They couldn't find anything. However, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It could be underground, down below, if so. But there are other facilities not far away from Kapustin Yar. This is where they test some of their most advanced weapons, and UFOs visited quite often. We have testimonies of the military. And this is what Kapustin Yar more or less looks like. And some of the pictures, I guess, back from 1960s. It is one of the most secretive facilities still in Russia today. And again, UFOs have always been sighted in that area. Now, this is some of the, I can't translate it to you, but this is genuine documents which we, got our hands on after the end of the Soviet Union about the research program, designations, instructions, and reports taken by scientists who went out to the field of alleged UFO sightings and more. I've heard, we have some information. I still don't know about secret dust over, for example, Arkhangelsk area, or some of the encounters that are just rumored, because most of the information is still classified. And what's interesting is the newspapers in the Soviet Union were subjected to the instructions and laws to send all letters that came in from general population, to send it to the special centers for the collection of UFO information. And also observatories had to do the same. And you can see how they responded and sent their information directly to the centers for the collection of the UFO information. And also the actual document for the... This is something interesting. This gentleman, Roald Sagdeev, now lives in the United States. I know he doesn't speak about it or anything else, but he was one of the top Soviet academicians, and he was one of the directors of the institutes that participated in this program. Best Soviet institutes were set to study UFOs. All Soviet servicemen had to fill out information should they see something in the sky. It was a very detailed form which was collected and sent to 2 UFO research centers, one in Moscow, one in Leningrad. And again, we don't know what happened to the most of the information received. We're just proud of what we have in our hands. And it shows, for example, this Institute of Terrestrial Magnetism, it's active today. This was the main institute to collect academic information. But so that you know how the Soviet bureaucracy worked and what the military had to deal with. Us here, most of the top scientists did not want to do anything with UFOs. They had the bunkers, they were uncomfortable, plus American information from the bunkers, like the Donald Menzel book, was always available in the Soviet Union. While they said UFOs are bourgeois inventions, they never translated books by ufologists, but they translated books by enemies of ufologists with no issues. And Soviet scientists were not eager to deal with UFOs, but the military had no choice because they wanted to know what the hell is flying over our submarine bases. What is interfering with our aircraft? Why are some of them being shut down? And so forth. And that's what happened. And this is the case that interested Andropov personally. He was very much into it. It was actually observation by a counter-intelligence officer who was on leave with his friends when a gigantic disc-like object appeared over their boat, increased in size. It had bright color, bright whitish color, and it bothered them. But they were able to take very detailed information. And Andropov, outside of all the problems he had in the Soviet Union, he was interested in what's going on with UFOs. That's another description of the same case and some more documents we have. That's a very interesting elongated case from a UFO case from Ukraine of 1978. Well, about the same time, we had other observations of similar objects in the Soviet Union. And again, 1978, which was one of the most prominent years of UFO sightings, together with 1979, UFOs and USOs. Now, this was the case when our nations could have gone to nuclear war. 1982, this was investigated by the Setka program. For some time, the Soviets lost control over their nuclear silos. So the sequence had begun, and the missiles were being ready to be launched and sent towards the United States. nuclear warheads. What happened? There was a giant UFO over this area. It's in Ukraine. And Moscow controlled nothing. Everything was controlled by the UFO. Whatever game was played by aliens, let's call it this way, they relented after a while and everything went back to normal. But the Soviets were so scared, they sent their investigative team there the second day. I talked about it on some TV programs, and I kept collecting information, and I found a very persistent Russian or Ukrainian citizen today who served during that time, and he got testimony from other soldiers who were in the area, because he wanted to know what it was. And he said that the UFO was observed also in the nearby villages, and there were different descriptions of it, but it definitely existed. And this was one of the times when nuclear war was really possible. I think ABC, many years ago with Peter Jennings, they also ran a program about it, to the extent possible. This is one of the cases when military had to do something about UFOs, and they didn't know what to do. This is not far from Voronezh. This is from the area where they test their top new military jets, or tested. And basically, the leaders of that area went to the military wing of the Setka program and said, help us. Our jets are being shot down. It's not NATO, it's not the Chinese. Something is taking them down. And there were stories of the immobile black cloud hovering for a long time over Soviet military base. So they sent their jets with pilots inside, and then all the jets stopped functioning. Pilots were going crazy until they were able finally to leave that, somehow to leave that cloud. Still unexplained case, I believe from 1974. You know, but it continued all into the 1980s. So that's what the Soviets faced actively. This is a town in the Arctic Circle area of the Soviet Union. It's still inaccessible to foreigners. A lot of UFOs have been sighted over this area. And of course, these were no American jets. Very, very interesting, in a way, sinister place, and UFOs are always prevalent. I'm not sure about today. You still cannot get to it. Some of the, I already showed this before. Now, nothing much remains today, just the church and, you know, some landscape. But this was the area of the secretive Soviet airstrip. Again, an airfield where they tested military jets, and it's called Smolino. This is where the UFOs were seen and tried to make contacts. What the Soviets did, there was a general in charge of it, Yeremenko, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Yeremenko. He made soldiers get into a line when UFOs would be sighted over the area, extend their hands, and start raising them and making other signs as to wave to UFOs, you know, fiery objects in the sky, sometimes doing their own maneuvers and so forth. And they reported that the UFOs would actually respond by flattening their shapes, by changing their shapes when the soldiers waved their hands. We're talking about, you know, a few dozen of soldiers, if not more. So this was very interesting, but, you know, it's one of the reports that we have available. And, of course, we cannot escape this. USOs were, you know, those unidentified submersible objects of different shapes, usually gigantic shapes, bothered Soviet Navy to no avail, always. And they had to create their own research programs within the Setka program and outside to study those objects, because there were no American submarines. And in my videos, the most recent one that I just put up is the one about the 1966 expedition, Soviet secret submarine expedition to the Easter Island and what they encountered in that area. It's very interesting stuff. One of the people who died not that long ago, Vice Admiral Matushkin, he was very well known and experienced Soviet submarine commander. He encountered UFOs in different areas of the world. He was not afraid to speak about it. But again, he passed away, and before he did, he revealed information about the giant objects they had observed by Greenland that broke through the ice, fell through from the sky, broke through the ice right before their submarine went in, and a few other observations he did in secretive Soviet territories. And I'll give you time to ask questions too, and whatever I have not answered, I'm sure you'll probably find in my videos too. I have a lot to fill in. Now, 1978, I told you it was a significant year. Here is why. He was responsible for the missiles that took down American U-2 spy plane back in 1963. He was a brilliant Soviet scientist who also served time in concentration camps, I think under Stalin time, Glushko. And he ordered Soviet troops in Kazakhstan in 1978 over an area of secret testing airfield to shoot down one of the UFOs. Allegedly, this is what happened. I have documents from 2 people who were serving there at the time. Allegedly, they shot down a UFO and collected enough information to help them use it in the creation of their own advanced missiles. Very interesting case, a lot of details about it, and I wish I knew more. But knowing the person and the authority he had at the time with the Soviet armed forces, I tend to believe they did shoot something down. Whether it was a UFO, I'm not sure. And the 1982 case about the so-called swimmers is one of my most popular, I guess, subjects that people from all over the world reach out to me about. 1982, Soviet armed forces detected so-called swimmers, gigantic humanoids, 9 feet tall, without any breathing apparatuses, swimming in the bottom of Lake Baikal, doing what they need to do, and of course not paying attention to the Soviets. So they try to catch them, they they send in frogmen who try to capture them. They were thrown out from the water, decomposition did not work. Anyway, they died because you can't do it. You have to go through stages before you exit such deep waters. Soviet soldiers died because they didn't have enough stations to treat them, and they didn't capture anybody. But the order went out through the Soviet armed forces to stop any attempts to capture unidentified humanoids like this. In my later research, I found other cases of similar objects, including one Setka case from 1982, same time, where an object exploded not far from Voronezh, again in the territory of the Soviet military facility, and let's call it an alien ran out. It was a humanoid 9 feet tall, also in silvery costume, just like a suit, like the objects or beings that they had observed down below. I also found confirmation, interesting, from 1932 by a scientist who alleged that he was kidnapped. It was on the shores of the White Sea in North Russia, North Soviet Union, who spent some time in the underwater base, and his description of the beings is identical to what was described in 1982 and, excuse me, later in 2000 in the Far East, when the now Russian naval counterintelligence had to do investigation of a being that was sighted there. And the book is by somebody who was a well-known Soviet writer, a former interpreter of Chinese for Khrushchev, who investigated this case. Unbeknownst to him, he went to the shores of Lake Baikal in 1986, and he met fishermen who told him about, who were discussing the case when some years ago they saw soldiers flying out, frogmen flying out from the bottom of the lake, 1982. And that's when he became interested in this. And I did my research from early 1990s. Before he died, we exchanged letters with Mikhail Demidenko. So I wanted to ask you if you have any questions. This is your time to ask. This is a workshop, and I wish. No, Mikhail Demidenko's book is not translated as yet. Yes, use the microphone, please. That's okay. But let me tell you more about Demidenko before we go away. Now, he was there are some people who are perceptive and want to ask questions. And he had good connections in the Soviet and the Russian army. And he didn't like the Soviet government like I didn't and a few other people, but he had to be very careful. So, for example, the book that I showed you, this was about Americans in Vietnam, but also he revealed some other information about Soviets in the Far East, but carefully. Now, but he could ask questions and not publish them. And later, after the Soviet Union was gone, he published his memoirs about time spent in Tibet and China. And listen to this. He spoke to a Mongolian monk who could speak fluent Russian. It was in 1950s in China when he was with Khrushchev and others. And this monk told him that he saw caves in China where suspended in sleep were gigantic humanoid beings. And the description was almost identical to what was reported in 1982. He said the Chinese Red Army took them out and they gutted them, and then cut them to pieces, and he was laughing. That's what they would do at the time. And he knew a few other secrets from those areas, which are really very interesting: Pamir, Tibet, and China. His books are not available in English.
So my question is, and maybe this is a real rookie question, because I'm a real rookie when it comes to this, but it seems like you're describing situations where there is much more of an aggressive stance from any of these UFOs. In the 1944, the death of 1,500 Nazis and a couple of hundred Russians, the plane being shot down, the people being thrown into the water, and also a proliferation of sightings that seem much greater than have happened anywhere else in the world that's been published.
Absolutely, and it's not, this information wasn't that easy to get, but we have very persistent people. Some of them are gone now, some of them passed away in the former Soviet Union because they wanted to have knowledge, and they couldn't because it was forbidden. But people don't just take it lying down, so they went and asked questions like Soviet UFO researchers, Felix Ziegel and others. And also they had another issue. They knew that the Soviets knew that CIA was very much interested in Soviet UFO research as well. So ufologists had to be very careful because Ziegel was being basically shadowed by American intelligence too. And the Soviets knew it, so he was in a very difficult case. Nevertheless, all this information they collected through the years, and it was coming out. Now, about the encounters. This is the Soviet military encounters. There were other interesting cases I mentioned in my lecture. For example, when a UFO in 1986, where I'm from, in Kiev, actually helped extinguish the effects of the explosion at the Chernobyl power nuclear station. And it was reported by scientists, technicians, who were working at the station at the time, how an object emitted a ray of light that actually went and diminished the radiation. And there were other cases of benign UFO interference.
So my question then is, why? Why is there seeming to be more actual involvement in the stories that you're telling and the stories that I've heard outside of Russia? Any concepts of that or ideas behind that?
Well, because it's not, in the Soviet Union, we were not dealing with any government that had to report to the population. It wasn't democratically elected. If they saw a danger, they would go ahead and try to shoot it down. And this is a good question, because I should mention that in 1960s, according to a few people that even I showed here, there were orders given down into the Soviet armed forces not to shoot at UFOs, not to interact with them, because they learned their lesson in 1953, and also in 1966 there were some cases. Nevertheless, local commanders sometimes screwed up. For example, during the Iran-Iraq war, there was a case in Kazakhstan, very close territory close to Iran. And the Soviets were nervous. You know, there was so much fighting, and all of a sudden there was a gigantic 500-meter, I think, in diameter object that appeared out of nowhere over the Soviet military facility. And they had artillery and so forth. So the commander blinked and said, "Shoot." And they lost a number of soldiers, and he was demoted. And that's another issue when the orders came down: do not shoot. Go ahead, sir.
I've been coming for 6 years, so whenever I take it you're new at Contact. So when I looked up your bio, I started reading a lot of your history. And maybe I got it mixed up, but aren't you the gentleman who had wrote articles about a tribe of giant people way up in Siberia that has been untouched by contact, actually, of human beings, let's just say? They don't know anything about television or newspaper or anything. Does that sound like you?
No, that wasn't me. But in Siberia, I'll tell you, my father served in the Soviet army towards late 1950s, you know, about the time of the Hungarian Revolution and so forth. And he served in the area I loved, you know, Russian Far East, Siberia, and I like to bring stories from there. Now, he was in the Soviet army during the time when the concentration camps were being opened and people let out. He told me horrible stories that he had observed. For example, imagine concentration camps where females were kept for 20 years, okay? And then they were let out. And the things that he had seen, this is no joking matter. He saw cannibals. There was a case of when the KGB landed, whatever the KGB was at the time, where his military unit was located, and they were hunting down cannibals who killed and ate geologists. And so they sent, you know, as an example. But he also told me stories about the villages of the so-called old believers, the religious dissidents from the 18th century who escaped from the Tsar and the world into the thick forest of taiga. And the villages like that are still being found today. They're not giant people, they're hard-working people. And they tend to be healthier than maybe most of us because all they do is work and they don't have any technology around them. But you can see a lot of strange things there.
Well, to tie in with that, this particular area, they experience UFO contact and have for a long time. It's normal to them. It's just like you and I walking, visiting each other's country. Have you heard of that?
Well, let's say there's religious people, if they had experienced UFOs or aliens, they would consider them to be agents of the devil. But speaking about that area, of those areas of Siberia, I have a case of animal mutilation, one of the few, that goes back to the 1860s. Okay? And UFOs, or whatever they were observed in the area. Now, there is an area in Russia called Yakutia. It's by the Arctic Ocean, Republic of Sakha. It's very hard to get to, but it's beautiful land. It's very hard to travel. It's cold, horrible conditions. Sometimes villages that are a few hundred miles apart can't get to each other unless they use special vehicles and so forth. Well, the UFOs are attracted to that area tremendously because diamonds have been found, thousands of diamonds, industrial-grade diamonds, and it was a state secret in the Soviet Union. For some reason, UFOs are attracted also to areas of tremendous natural resources and areas of tremendous ecological damage human race has done to our planet. And in my books, in my research, in my videos, you will see how some of the UFOs actually helped. Not only this case in Kiev, for example, but for example, in Central Asia, there is a case where UFOs were actually observed by Soviet military spy stations and others.
Just back to your question. Linda talked about American pilots being shut down when they were behaving aggressively. It's just that this country really hushes it up very good. Russian system fell down, so all of a sudden we have this things, all kinds of things exposed. But my question to you, you mentioned 1950s when they first started, two governments started to talk about the UFOs. So you are saying that 1950s, I don't know if I'm right, but maybe that's like a beginning of this communist scare in the US. So even though that there was a Cold War and threats, they were actually talking?
Absolutely. And I don't like the Soviet system. I always wanted freedom for Ukraine, for the rest of the Soviet Union, for example. And I believed Cold War was true, and to an extent it was. But at the highest levels, there was no war. At the highest level, I'm convinced they talked to each other from 1953. But it's not only myself. It's people that have been active in the UFO research in the Soviet Union, and they say that United States, United Kingdom, USSR, and France, Germany was not a player at the time, those were the countries that began exchanging information. Something happened in 1953 which forced them to. I don't think this Siberian case was one of those cases that happened. Something else might have taken place. And there were other years in the history of our planet that you had very strong UFO, waves of UFO interaction. For example, 1966, where we had earthquakes all over the world, one horrible in Central Asia. UFOs were observed. But did you know this is the history of the United States? In 1966, future President Ford was screaming at the Congress, we have to go and study UFOs, to put it simply. Governor of Florida, his airplane was, I don't want to say attacked, but interacted by a UFO. This was in the newspapers. It's in my video, because I wanted to bring together pieces of information from all over the world. In 1966, after my video came out, people from Northeast responded and said, oh, I was a child. I remember UFOs in the sky over Chicago and others. And then there were cases in Australia. And just not that long ago, I got my hands on the information about this Soviet secret expedition to Easter Island. It was not only Easter Island. They pretended that they wanted to go around American bases and to prove that the Soviet Navy is capable of doing circumnavigational expedition without ever surfacing. They went to the Easter Island. They saw a gigantic object.
So I wanted to get your opinion on your thoughts, if you had any, about that case in the 50s where Soviet Union, Siberia, where the hikers got killed and murdered. There was like 20 of them. Or 50.
Okay, 9 people. And this was a very interesting case. I talked about it in my lecture yesterday, and I can't talk too much now, but it's in my videos too. And the videos are free, so you can see them. It was called the Dyatlov Pass. And they went to the so-called Mountain of the Dead. And this area is in the Ural Mountains, far remote Ural Mountains. Very hard to get to. Local people don't want you to go there because this is their sacred land. They don't want foreigners. Soviet government wasn't that much interested in this territory. Yeah, it's under the control, but there's nothing to do. These 9 people died in horrible fashion. Nobody knows how. The investigation is still classified to an extent because it was interrupted. Criminal investigation. People who started getting into good details about the case were removed. It was hushed up. Local Communist Party officials in charge of the territory shipped them out and said, that's enough. I have documents from the doctor who was later removed from the case. She said there were more bodies, more corpses. What's unusual about this case is the way they died. It's horrible. 1 or 2 of them had their bones smashed to, it's like, imagine oatmeal. This is what the bones were like after. But the skin was intact. Nobody knew. It was orange colored. It's a horrible case. And there are many in Russia who are trying to find explanations. Was it because of the missile test? largely disproved. Nobody wants to test missiles so far away. It's not practical. Was it because of UFOs? Well, UFOs were sighted 2 days before. It was in the paper, local paper. Was it because of the locals would kill them? No, locals don't kill, even if you trespass on their lands, local tribes. So it's like a blood libel, you know. Was it because it was a KGB CIA operation where they faced each other and killed each other? Very interesting, because some of the people in the group had very spotty biographies. And I tried to explain yesterday, don't judge them by today's standards. Some of them lived under German occupation, and when you do, you're marked for life in the Soviet Union as a traitor. So they tried to change their biographies. Some of them might have done something else in the past, and they try to cover it up. It's one of the darkest secrets in the Soviet Union. I started bringing information back in the early 1990s about this case, and I continue. I have another explanation, which is in my videos. It's called the Golden Woman. And the Golden Woman is a creature that's been known for thousands of years in Asia and also all the way to North Europe. I believe Jumala was the name that the Vikings called her. To put it in simple terms, it's a robotic-like creature, a statue that was reported to exist in Siberia, in other areas like that, moving around, protected by natives from others, and it killed those who trespassed or bothered her by something that could be described as infrasound impact, infrasound radiation. I'm being very simplistic. Now, the lair of this Golden Woman is reported to be on the mountain next to the mountain of the dead. But nobody, Philip Mantel also helped me with that, and we got information from Siberia. We read books from God knows where in Russian language, and we found more or less the exact location of this being. It's very close to that area, so we imagine maybe those climbers did something, those mountaineers, something to bother this strange creature. It's an ongoing investigation. It's very interesting. But that mountain, locals will not let you come to, for sure, because they are afraid.
Thank you. And
Thank you. More than crushed to very small fragments. That's one of the, what should I say, peculiarities of this case. Oh yeah, you should read the whole. There is a lot more. The way they died, how they, how they were found, and there are photographs. I have a number of photographs in my video. It's not on a nice site.
Apparently a UFO, I heard, was spotted like the day before. And
yeah.
See photographs, they're like shadowy figures in the background and the photograph.
I don't know about the shadow figures. I'm only going by what's in the Soviet media, because that's very interesting, because UFOs were, but you need to know that others died in that area, other groups too. That it's not being reported, but it happened a few years later. A very interesting.
We talk about following the evidence, and these bones were emulsified. I think that's the word we would use. And the skin not disturbed. Is that my understanding?
Yes.
So what could do that? There's sound vibrations possibly that could do that.
That's interesting.
Follow the evidence. What could possibly do that?
There was interesting evidence on some of the, it's always hard for me to pronounce this, on some of the trees around the area. Trees that grow in the areas, like the impact of energy wave, like lasers. Something like that were discovered in some of the vegetation in the area. There were more evidence, but you need to understand, we don't have our hands, and researchers in Russia on most of it, because it's still classified. The case is still classified to an extent.
But this suggests some kind of wave vibration when the skin isn't disturbed.
Right.
No, not impact. So there wasn't some creature beating on them.
I didn't say that.
No,
there are people who say, well, maybe the Bigfoot. This is naive. Bigfoot or missiles. A missile flies over. It doesn't, something interacted with them. And it wasn't this snowfall. What is the, I forgot the term, when, you know, when the snow, what's the right term? When a large amount of snow falls down from the mountain.
Avalanche.
Avalanche. And sorry, it wasn't that. You're absolutely right.
Or if it's hand to hand, you're going to die from vital areas being struck.
Yeah.
So none of those would qualify. That's not bones.
No.
So it can't be humans by hand.
There were more strange descriptions of that. I mean, they found more interesting clues. For example, somebody would undress in horrible cold. They would undress and crawl to the, take off everything. I mean, it's very unusual case. I have more details in my books as well, but I urge you also to listen, because I brought a lot of interesting latest stuff in my video, but I keep on my Facebook, I bring more information because others are trying to get to that place and they create more problems because they get lost and then they have to bring special forces, rescue forces from the army and so forth.
Weren't some tongues ripped out?
Yes. D-Y-T-L-O-V. I urge you, it's not it's not to promote myself, but if you like knowledge, this is what I do in my free time. This is what I do in research. You can find it in my flyers, and it's a very interesting.
There's a well-done documentary on it. They do about a half hour, an hour on it. Have you seen it? It's called Strange Mysteries, and they go into this pretty deeply, and they show pictures.
Yeah, there are movies too.
Exactly.
Tunguska is, I would say, the best UFO case of the 20th century. Tunguska was, in June of 1908, an object exploded or imploded or something happened to it over the Taiga region of the of Russian Empire. It took with it whole areas of taiga, and the biophysical impact is still felt in the area and mutations, but nothing was ever recovered. There are different theories as to what it was, a meteorite, a bolide, or you name it, gas explosions. Some people say, and very interesting, is that it was an intercept of an object by a so-called sentinel located in Yakutia area in that Arctic region, which I didn't have a chance to go into, but again, it's in my videos. What it is that legends have it that there are remnants of ancient civilization and craft embedded in permafrost. And for sure there are. Some of them are still in that area. There have been so-called expeditions or visitors to the area who suffered from radiation. And locals have, you can call it ancient alien stories about objects that are deep down in permafrost that kind of sunk in through the ages, and once in a while they shoot out and a sentinel, a protector that takes out any celestial danger that's flying towards Earth. This was one of the cases. However, something else happened in 1908. You know about Tesla, and people ask me about Tesla. Fine, you know enough about Tesla without me in the United States. But outside of that, I found out about two Russian scientists. One of them, they were assassinated in the times of the Russian Empire, where things like that did not happen. They were. One of them was killed in 1908. He invented ways to eliminate war. Actually, long-distance explosion of enemy ammunition by waves that he invented. He was Tesla knew him. He also had inventions that are similar to Tesla's. The claim is that even earlier than Tesla, maybe a month or two, it doesn't matter. He was one of the top scientists in the Russian Empire, well known at the time. He worked with the funds provided by the Russian Navy for the developments of his weapons. I don't think everything went the way he wanted to. Anyway, in 1908, he was assassinated. He went to a hospital and never came out. And I have the full story. It's one of my latest videos. What's fascinating is the year 1908 and the knowledge of Tesla, and vice versa. No, not yet.
If you go there, you'll see that he did a lot of work with Russian scientists. One of them was when he was making the free energy. When he was working with free energy, which we supposedly have now, or we could have, and this Russian scientist was working with him, and they discovered through the pyramids how they lit up and blah, 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 blah. And the scientist was supposed to meet with him. Now, Tesla could care less about money. The particular scientist wanted money. They were going to meet. The scientist was assassinated. Now, I don't know if it's the same gentleman as you're talking about or not, but he was assassinated. But to tie this together with the bones that this gentleman was saying and all, what's the one way that all the ETs, not all, but most of the ET spaceships, saucers, how do they control? Do they have instruments? Do they have steering wheels? No. They sit there and it's all done up here. Now, I'm sure you've seen all the stories about how they went back, how we have our own flying saucers and all that, of course. Okay. They control all their, how else could they turn on a dime and all? It's all here. So if they can do that, they could fry us, and we wouldn't even know we're fried mentally. Also, there was a documentary on one of the stations, Netflix, I think. Netflix said if right now we're at 20% of the brain, roughly. That's what we use. We go to 50% and we start moving things. We go to 80%. They're scared to death to go to 90, 100% because what happens then, we won't have a body. We'll just be a brain. So when you go back and you think of all this stuff that's happened and you think it's a monster, that's what the CIA wants you to think. That's why the 50s, you had all these movies about monsters and all this garbage. Is because they knew that these ETs controlled all their spacecraft by sitting there in a chair. Now, how did they know that? Because when in Area 51, and I've been there, the spaceships, when some people went into it and looked around, there was nothing there but a chair. No instruments, no technology. Now you tell me. Now you say, well, I'm probably full of beans, and maybe I am. But if you look back in the records, you'll see. And if you look back who the people who went back in that the CIA ended up taking care of one way or the other, you'll see. Therefore, if they could control a spaceship and go from here to another world, they surely could burn us from the inside out. And they believe that that's how we discovered lasers.
Well, let me talk about lasers. The other scientist who was assassinated in 1903, Filipov, that's very interesting, and you will see. He actually allegedly invented lasers. And, you know, you got to think, who would take him out? Enemy agents, like that. But it's very interesting case from the old Russia. Did you have any more questions?
If you would go back to the Russian Revolution.
Yes.
Was that what, 1918?
1917.
17. And you said that there is a document or maybe few documents that talk about the interaction between was it Red Army?
Testimony, Red Army, yeah. There was a nurse that, not only the nurse, but anyway, a regiment, a unit of this Red Army was actually, they encountered beings, very unusual beings, and the way they described how they look, and tall beings in the area where they operated, and I think they were using their weapons, whatever they had at the time. They were placed on the special carts that the Red Army used, with horses pulling them, and that's what they used to shoot at UFOs and so forth. It was a very interesting case. But most of the cases there are some cases from 1930s. Very interesting cases, for example, collected by Soviet ufologists. I've read some interesting information. But most of the cases documented take place in 1940s and on. Because you had better equipment.
And if I can just make one comment.
Sure.
I can read some of the Cyrillic, so
Good.
I could see the meaning. I could make out the meaning of those drawings. It would be very interesting for the audience who can't do that to see the translation. You know, like it says krasny kvadrat,
Right.
you know, and all of that, so that they can actually relate to what's on the drawing. And I find them to be very interesting.
Absolutely. It's just because of the time, I kind of wanted to gloss over.
I was just curious if in Russia, if you guys have a problem with people getting abducted.
Apparently they do
A lot
not.
of people don't want to talk about that.
Well, why? Well, there is still a very interesting politician, Kirsan Ilyumzhinov. He is the head of used to be head of the International Chess Federation. He was president of Kalmykia, the only Buddhist republic within Russian Federation. He was quite open. 1997, he was abducted, spent some time on a very big UFO, interacted with aliens, nothing, nothing lewd, nothing like that. You know, he just changed information with them, and then he was brought back to his Moscow apartment, and he was very angry at his bodyguards because they didn't see that he was gone. It was interesting, and he came out and he spoke about it more and more. I think they might have, were teaching him something. No, he didn't go into that. But he's a clever guy. He's a big businessman. He's a millionaire. He's very shrewd. So, if you want, I can go to some of the. If you want to see something that's written in Cyrillic, I don't mind. Do we have time? It's up to you.
Let me see. It's 6:15, so you've got 18 minutes.
Okay. For sure. I am looking at the window. Lavrenko lived somewhere here. The object moved from here, hovered here. This is west. This is south. This is east. So this is how he was observing the object. UFO over Mongolia, May of 1984, drawing by Alexeyev. Yeah, a military installation. Yeah, and he wasn't the only one that saw it. So let me see what else I can do. For example, this is from Chechnya. Okay, let's see, shining conus more than one over the Checheno-Ingushetia Republic. The rings around this conus area touch the base of the next cone as an example. Yep. And let's see what's here. UFO over Grozny, 15th of August 1991, Cassiopeia constellation. This is projector, this is red square, white square. And here, red light, opaque light, and this is how the object was observed by infantry Private Alimov. And this is a UFO picture. So it's not much different than when you get reports from the American observers or anybody else. Yeah, this is lights of the indefinite colors. This is the body, and they're trying the visual part of the moon. They're trying to see that it's like 1/3 of the size of the moon. you know, and this was over the Baikonur, again, 1978 in December. So, yeah. And again, this is from the, and this was all done by military. Because of the subject of our workshop, I kind of wanted to limit it to the military part, not the Navy, because this, I discussed Navy before, but basically what the military observed, Soviet Armed Forces, Navy did the same except for the underwater objects to an extent. And they were quite worried and quite ready to continue their research, but it was shut down in 1985. Although they were all over the oceans of the world. Now, so that you know, most of the UFO sightings, according to the Soviets, are in the NATO waters, in the areas of Norway, some in the Baltic Sea, but some in the Far East. They mentioned the waters around Philippines. That's where they encountered very interesting USOs. And as I brought out in my other lectures, and you will see in the videos, the Sea of Okhotsk. This is by not far from Japan, and where the Kuril Islands are located. That's where the Russian army is active today, on some of the islands, very active. Islands they captured from Japan back in 1945, especially one of them, the Soviet army and a Russian army and scientists. The second expedition blocked off the island, sealed it off, and they're studying. The reason? They got this island without any fight in 1945 after the Japanese had destroyed most of the secretive installations. Still some are left. And the rumors are that there are underground stories that go down 54 floors. It's an island. It's a volcanic island. There have been a number of eruptions. You will see it in my video. And interesting things are found in the waters around the island. There is a small little island also next to it, including now 2 American submarines that were allegedly destroyed by a Japanese Imperial Navy. The Russians never fought. They didn't fight. The Japanese gave them the keys to the island and left. They were fighting for all other islands. Now, when Nazi Germany was crushed, Nazi submarines still visited that island from May to, I believe, August of 1945. You can see in the photographs I present the airfield that was built by the Japanese and remnants of the German barrels that they used for their submarines, other remnants of the of the Nazi army, and a few more things. There is an island next to it called Rashua. I also have about that. Not that long, in the 1980s, the some Soviet divers found remnants of ruins of ancient cities in the waters of Rashua. I don't know. Nobody ever studied it after that. They don't. You know, this is not a priority now. But UFOs had been sighted because I did a detailed research. Had been sighted over that island as well, and there are some other islands in that chain which are very unusual, but none are so unusual like Matua. This is a story that's happening. I was on George Knapp with this, and I hope to come back soon because there is a little bit more information that's coming out, but not enough because it's now in the hands of the Russian army. It was always Soviet territory after 1945. They didn't pay attention to it. Private investigators would visit the island, and they kept saying, there's something unusual about it. Something is going on. We see things that we shouldn't be there. There even you know, equipment left behind in some areas. We can understand. There are caves that lead to nowhere. And there are, you know, people disappear when they go and try to look, get into channels that the Japanese basically sealed off. And it's a very interesting story. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.